Hi, welcome to the 2013 Global Social Responsibility Conference, which is held at St. Cloud State University and St. Cloud Technical and Community College. The conference is sponsored and organized by the SCSU Social Responsibility Master's Degree Program, teaching knowledge and skills for social justice, peace, environment, and animals. If you find this conference interesting, please check out the Master's Degree Program on the web. We want to thank our many co-sponsors, which include the St. Cloud Technical and Community College, the SCSU Women's Center, the School of Education, the SCSU Alumni Relations, Rita J. Wood and Truman D. Wood Trust, UPB, Theater and Film Studies, Mass Communications, Global Studies, and Environmental and Technological Studies.
Please remember to fill out your evaluations that we handed out at the door, and we will be back there again collecting them at the end of this presentation. And now I am honored to introduce this session, Climate Change in Our Own Backyard and Its Consequences, by Mark Seeley from the University of Minnesota, and he's a meteorologist. So let's give him a round of applause to welcome him.
Well, hello. Thank you for coming to this event. I don't often get up to St. Cloud State, but I'm happy to be here today. Looks like it's been a very diverse program this week, and I applaud the planners who put all this together. I'm both a meteorologist and a climatologist, so my goal today, though, is to talk to you as a climatologist, not as a meteorologist. So if you want to know tomorrow's weather, just turn on your NOAA weather radio. I'm going to talk about our state. Climate change is a contentious but a very important issue of our lifetime, and I think that the perspective I'll share with you today is coming from, as the title suggests, the data in our own backyard. I'm not going to talk much about climate modelers. I'm not a climate modeler. I'm a measurements person, so I deploy instruments to measure things, and then I derive interpretation from the history of measurements. So that's the perspective I'm going to share with you today. I hope you'll come away with some thoughts of your own and perhaps provoked to talk about this topic more with your neighbor or your family or your colleagues or what have you. I'm not getting this to advance. There it goes. As a reminder of the great diversity of our state, we pride ourselves as a culture in Minnesota on our resilience, or perhaps more succinctly, what we put up with. And just for example, on today's date, in 1927, it was 91 degrees down at Chatfield in southeastern Minnesota. Similarly, today's date in 1917 was -10 up at Grand Rapids. We had 3-inch thunderstorm rain at Garrison on this date in 1995, and we had a 10-inch snowfall at Caribou on this date in 2001 up in Kitson County. So a roll of the dice by Mother Nature on any given day of the year can give us tremendous variability. In fact, that theme of variability is inherent in most of what I'll talk to you about, which I hope to present as data and stories and research and interpretation. The challenge for us in our neck of the woods is that the variability is so extreme that when you interpret climate data, trying to interpret signal from noise is very difficult, and we'll say more about that later. For the next 50 minutes or so, I've got this broken down into segments. I want to talk about a brief history of our state, the perceptions of climate behavior that we have, that is how we as human beings perceive that climate behaves, some of the changing features in Minnesota based on measured attributes that are embedded in our state database, some consequences of those changing attributes, which are already evident and have already been researched by many, some scales of extremes, and then a little bit about the future. In terms of our history, I'm not going to go way back in time. Some of you may know that I'm author of the Minnesota Weather Almanac, which is the comprehensive weather and climate history of the state since 1807, but I'm not going to go back that far. Some of these events may ring a bell with some of you. Some of you may have read about them. A few of you may have experienced them. They were all highly consequential. They were all highly consequential, either weather or climate events. And the 1976 drought was actually so devastating to the agricultural economy in our state that it created my faculty position at the University of Minnesota. The Minnesota legislature decided that the University of Minnesota College of Agriculture needed a climate scientist, so they created a faculty position and they recruited me to fill it. Some of the other events depicted on here have been of varying scales of consequence. Some have amounted to over $1 billion in consequence, either because of insurance claims or because of damage to the state infrastructure. The last EF5 tornado we had in Minnesota was down at Chandler in June of 1992. Anybody here from southwestern Minnesota? No southwestern Minnesotans here. Devastated the town of Chandler in that particular year. We, fortunately, unlike our states in the southern and central plains, have not experienced that many EF5 tornadoes in our state history, but we've certainly had our share overall of tornadoes. Let's see if the next slide, there we go. The chronology of disasters, even up through the present year, shows that this year, as you can see on the bottom here, we had the devastating April ice storm that closed down southwestern Minnesota. Many southwestern Minnesota communities were highly impacted by the ice storm in April earlier this year. And then the wet spring we had. And in fact, it was so wet that we had the largest filing of prevented planting claims, that is, farmers who were prevented from planting this spring, in decades. A huge volume of claims for prevented planting this year. A couple of other historical perceptions to share with you. This is a footprint, a graphical footprint of the climate anomaly of 2012 related to temperature. The graphic depicts the average monthly temperature of the 48 contiguous states, including our state of Minnesota, for 2012, overlaid on a graphic that has all similar data back to 1895. And what we show in the orange lines here are depictions of the 5 warmest years prior to 2012 over the 48 contiguous states. So you have 1921, 1999, 1934, 2006, and 1998 at the top of the historical distribution. We also see the 5 coldest years down here in the blue, and then all the in-between years in the gray. But what's striking about this statistical footprint is its amplitude and consistency. 2012 was significantly warmer and consistently warmer throughout the year above all previous years. And that's an unusual footprint. That's an unusual statistical footprint in our climate data. In the month of March alone in 2012, you may have heard me talk about that anomaly on the radio or on television. March of 2012 is, and still stands, as the single largest monthly temperature anomaly in Minnesota state history. We broke, on a statewide basis, we broke close to 800 temperature records that month alone. It was so warm. So we broke daytime high temperature records and we broke nighttime warm low temperature records. And so that's what the footprint graphically looked like. That's what the geography looked like. That's a measure of the geography of the anomaly of temperature in 2012, with all the states highlighted here by the National Climate Data Center, color-coded. The orange ones basically fall in their historic top 5. The red ones, like labeled as 118, are all their warmest years in history. And so the geographic extent of this climate footprint of warmth is close to the largest, if not the largest, geography of a temperature anomaly footprint that we've ever measured in our country. The stamp of warmth was virtually all over the country, with the one, you could argue, the one exception of the state of Washington, but you know, being ranked 89th, it's still in the warm part of the temperature distribution historically for the state of Washington. It's just not way up in the top few. The other anomaly, the other big footprint in 2012 that captured all of the climate science community's attention was the degree of drought. In 2012, over 2,200 American counties were declared by USDA to be in drought disaster, the largest geographic declaration of drought in USDA history. And even in 2013, as we've come forward and we're coming to the conclusion of 2013, many of the western states have remained in drought as a carryover of what happened to them in 2012. And so this too was a striking, what we call, climate footprint. The statistical character of this geographically and in terms of extent, the degree of drought was just absolutely amazing in a historical context. Now, what drives climate behavior? Transitioning from our brief history to perceptions of climate behavior. The Earth history and the science of the planet Earth history tells us that there's 3 categorical drivers of Earth's climate. There's tremendous embedded, in fact, there's 4.5 billion years worth of evidence for natural variability. The orbital geometry, the relationship between the sun and the Earth, the tilt of the Earth on its axes, the ocean currents and the ice sheets, the occasional asteroid impacts, massive volcanic eruptions that have occurred in Earth's history, a whole variety of things that we categorize under so-called natural variability have been drivers of the Earth's climate behavior. And they are still drivers of the Earth's climate behavior today. I'd like you to recall Mount Pinatubo's eruption in 1991 in the Philippines, which brought one of the coldest summers of the 20th century to North America because of all the material that got trapped in the northern hemisphere atmospheric circulation. But 2 other drivers are related to us. 2 other drivers of the Earth's climate behavior are related to us. Changes in the Earth's landscape, which probably more than any other species in Earth history we've had impact on, and changes in atmospheric composition, the Earth's atmosphere itself, and what it's composed of. And in composite, these 3 categorically drive the Earth climate behavior. Now, our perception of that behavior is interesting to review, and it's an important point, and for perhaps one that we as scientists talking about the issue of climate change neglect a little too much. So I want to spend a minute or 2 on this slide. This is a Stan Shagnon slide, by the way, one of the most decorated climate scientists in U.S. history. He was out of Illinois, University of Illinois. He's since passed away. But he wrote this famous paper in the 1990s about climate behavior, and he offered 4 human perceptions of climate behavior. The first was the stationary perception, And that goes all the way back to our founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington. You'll recall that many of these men that are so famous for other reasons were also daily weather observers. They also made measurements, they also kept logs of the weather behavior wherever they were, and that was important to them. The premise of the stationary perception of climate behavior is depicted here graphically, and we can use St. Cloud as an example. Here at St. Cloud, if we put together a history of daily observations of temperature or precipitation or what have you, across a period of time that encompasses years or decades, after a period of years or decades, from making measurements of those attributes, we can define the central tendency, sometimes referred to as the mean, the median, or the mode value. We can define the seasonality, how that attribute behaves seasonally, and we can define the extremes, the all-time extremes, high or low or what have you. And the premise with the stationary perception of climate behavior is that if you do this for a given number of years, you got all the knowledge you need to know. You know everything there is to know about the climate at that point on Earth. That's the stationary perception of climate behavior. The cyclical perception of climate behavior I'm not going to dwell on because, quite frankly, we don't have any evidence for it here in Minnesota. There's strong evidence for it in some of the subtropics and equatorial regions of the world, which are heavily influenced, much more so by the migration of the sun than we are up here in Minnesota in terms of seasonal cycles, warm, cold, wet, dry, etc. The variability perception of climate came along in the 20th century and was a modification of the stationary perception of climate behavior, and it acknowledged all of the character of the stationary perception of climate behavior statistically, except it acknowledged, look at the bands of variability. It simply acknowledged that as we measure the climate at a point on Earth, especially a mid-continent location like we have here in Minnesota, the variability about the central tendencies waxes and wanes. So sometimes one year is distinctly different than the next and distinctly different than the next. Other times in your life and mine, we go through years or sequences of years where it seems like the climate is stuck in a rut and it's the same, the same, the same. So the bands of variability about the central tendencies wax and wane, and we have lots of statistical evidence for that in Minnesota. Lastly is the trend shift view of climate behavior, which is premised on if the climate is disturbed, if you disturb the climate, and goodness knows we've done that lots of places. We dam a river, we take out a forest, we remove a wetland, we do any number of other things. We disturb the landscape and we disturb its interaction with the overlying atmosphere, and that gives us a change in the climate attributes there. Or we disturb the atmosphere. We change the composition of the atmosphere. Then suddenly we start to get measurements of climate attributes that form a statistical population in both central tendency and extremes that's outside the range of what we have historically characterized for that location. The disconcerting notion of the trend shift perception of climate behavior is that our infrastructure that supports our quality of life, the reason we have the quality of life that we have, is we're supported by an infrastructure, our fresh water supply system, our electric utility grid, the insurance instruments we use to insure our property and lives, our transportation system, our architecture, our public health care system. All of these are fine-tuned to a perception of climate behavior that is a combination of the stationary and the variability perceptions. Across generations, our infrastructure has been tweaked to operate effectively and support our quality of life based on those perceptions of climate